Thank you all for joining the Clinton Donnelly Show. I'm excited today to be talking to Jordan Bush, who is the head of the Thank God for Bitcoin project. And we're going to talk a little bit about his background, about the project. What does that mean to thank God for Bitcoin? And in an act of full disclosure, I want everyone to know that on the back of my phone, I have a Thank God
Hey,
for Bitcoin sticker. All right.
let's go.
So let's get into it. Thanks, you all. And if you could please hit the follow, like, subscribe button, I'd appreciate it very much. Thank you. Well, Jordan, thank you for joining us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to start this project?
Yeah, well, Clinton, first of all, thank you for having me. I need to get an address from you after this, and I'll shoot you some of our newer stickers too, and you can update your other various tech devices with copious amounts of thank God for Bitcoin propaganda.
All
No,
right.
so my background is has nothing to do with finance or technology. At least on the surface, I was a pastor in church planting missionary in Uruguay in South America. My wife and I and our kids moved there in 2015. We had two kids at that point, two little kids, and then we had two while we were there. And it was really while I was there that we went there to plant a church. Uruguay is one of the most secular countries in South America, and so we were anticipating ministering, maybe not completely, but primarily with secular Uruguayans. They have about 40% of the population claims to be atheist or agnostic, and so we went there with that in mind of ministering to people who are in just that state. My wife and I were both philosophy majors in college, and so we were used to having those kind of conversations, and yeah, just really wanted to minister in that capacity. And so we get there, and within a few weeks, we quickly realized that there's this event happening, which is that there's thousands of Venezuelan immigrants pouring into the country for reasons that we didn't really understand. And so over the course of a few months and years, we started to just as we're helping these people pick up the pieces of their lives, trying to start over. It was largely men who were moving and leaving their wives and kids back in Venezuela, moving to Uruguay, trying to get a job and then send money home. And so we just started as we were helping them, pick up the pieces of their lives, just trying to understand, why that had happened, and what was, just try to see if there's anything we can do about it. Or and so just over time, we just saw, man, this is the result of just the governments just devaluing their currencies by printing money into oblivion to fund promises that they made on the campaign trail, and just the governments. This is the one of the downside of can be a downside of democracies, is that every 4 years you've got a new guy, new people trying to compete for a job. And one of the most consistent ways for people to try to convince people to vote for them as opposed to the incumbent is to promise them more free stuff. And so currency, money printing is one of the ways that is primarily funded, at least over the last last 100 years in the U.S. and other countries around the world. And so basically, we just saw over time, we saw what that did to families, we saw what that did to churches and other nonprofits. And so even as we were seeing, like, obviously Venezuela was in the end stages of this, the end stages of this process. One of the things that we found out over time was that this had happened in almost every country in Latin America and many countries in Africa, other countries around the world, 3 to 4 times since 1971, when the U.S. went off the gold standard. And so just basically, the more that I was looking at Venezuela, I was like, okay, well, this is obviously the worst of it. But then as I looked around in Uruguay, I saw the same dynamic. We saw lots of very small churches that had, almost none of them were able to, even the ones that had existed for 40 or 50 years didn't have, many of them didn't have a building. Many of them didn't have pastors who were able to work at anything approaching, full time. And so they were forced to work 2 or 3 other jobs just to make ends meet, to be able to continue ministering. And so we just basically looked around and said, man, this is really unsustainable. And this was trying to figure out, like, what do you actually do about this? Like, you can depend on donations from the United States, and largely, the organizations that are there and thriving, with a couple exceptions, are receiving, money from outside. And so I just was looking at that, and that was never our desire going in there, is for us to stay there forever. The goal was, to go in there and tell people about Jesus, and then equip leaders, local leaders, and then have them kind of take the reins and take ownership of leading the church. And so to see the fact that, and to see the impact that money being broken had on this was kind of eye opening for me. And so it was a few years later, that I ended up getting involved with this group of people who were going to write this book called Thank God for Bitcoin, which basically talked about some of those things that I just addressed, and a number of other issues, and then presented as a one tool in the tool belt. One plan of attack would basically be a Bitcoin adoption as a way to opt out of this hamster wheel of currency devaluation and currency failure. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got involved.
Wow, that's a real drama.
Yeah.
I know I was very familiar. I lived for a time in Panama, and I was very
Okay.
familiar with uh, it was Hugo Chavez and then Maduro after him,
Yep.
and just
Yep.
what was interesting to me was while they had this kind of like, well, they're basically Marxist type of claims they were making, promises, but the devaluation of the currency just kept on going on and on and on.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be in parallel with uh, the increased authoritarianism inside the country. And I remember I was involved with one church that they wanted to bring a pastor in from Venezuela,
Mm.
and so we had to work out funding, and we had to create a context for him to leave the country legitimately,
Yep.
and then for his kids, his wife to follow, and it was all a big pretext just to get somebody out.
Yep.
And and the destruction of, when you're in a hyperinflating environment, the money you get today, you have to spend today, because
Yep.
tomorrow it's worthless.
Yeah.
And then that drives a whole consumption level and a
Correct.
lack of savings that just drives people into continual, let's say, I mean, there is some level of impoverishment, but there's a lack of wealth.
Yep.
Maybe a better way to look at it, and it just becomes inescapable. Keeps them down, keeps the people down, so that they can't really rise up against the authoritarian governments. And I thought that was a unique situation there in Venezuela, at least locally. But
Yep.
you're right. We're seeing more and more of it happening all the time.
Yeah.
So
And
what made
that's
you shift?
yeah. Yeah, basically, I mean, part of the thing was, I mean, again, Venezuela is one of them, but then right across the river from us in Uruguay was Argentina, and Argentina, has experienced the same exact thing. I mean, you're talking about one of the richest places on earth in terms of the natural resources and all kinds of stuff, but Venezuela was very similar. I mean, gas up until during the time they had rampant hyperinflation going on, and gas prices were still like 2 cents a gallon for for a large part of the last few years. And so, like, it just blew my mind to see. It's not a question of, do you have resources. Like, it's not like you can only get to this point if you don't have natural resources. Like, these people had all of that, and just through wanton spending and all these different things, it just completely destroyed them. But in terms of my like shift, basically we were nearing what ended up being the end of our time in Uruguay. We hadn't taken a furlough for basically 5 years, which furlough is, fancy missions word to for just coming back to the United States and and just coming back for a bit and visiting people who are who've been supporting you, and kind of telling them how things have gone. And so we ended up coming back at the end of 2019, and yeah, fall of 2019, we went back for two months, and then kind of came back to Uruguay end of 2019. And long story short, ended up merging our church with another small church, and that was the week before COVID started. And so that ended up being a lifesaver. The Lord was super kind to us there, and so we ended up merging, and then for 2 years, an additional 2 more years, so a total of almost 7, we stayed in Uruguay, helped those two churches merge, and then yeah, at the end of 2021, we ended up coming back to the States. And so again, we'd written the book at the beginning of 21. Um, I jokingly tell people that I get to experience every Protestant's dream, which is the book came out the same week as the book by the Pope, and we were outselling the Pope. So we were like, take that, Bishop of Rome. Uh, so we basically went through this thing where the book came out. We came back to the States, and so I started again, there's more to it than this, but that had some changing theological convictions that was going to make it difficult for us to remain in the same capacity with the same organization we were with. And so I just basically was trying to figure out, okay, we're not going to go back to Uruguay, or it looks like we're not going to go back to Uruguay. What does this mean in terms of work? Like, what am I going to do? And so when I ended up, again, long story short, arranging this 1 day conference in Miami the day before the main Bitcoin conference, and so we arranged that, and me and another guy just did it as with a little bit of free time we had. And in the aftermath of that, we had a ton of people show up, and just way more people than we were expecting, including some celebrities. And we had Tim Tebow show up. We had some Senate candidates. We had some gubernatorial candidates from different states, and it just was wild. And so in the aftermath, some of the other authors of Thank God for Bitcoin, who are either entrepreneurs or Bitcoin OGs, buying Bitcoin at sub $5 a coin, just basically came to me and just basically said, hey, we know you're looking for something, looking for work, and we know that you obviously care about this issue and see how it affects churches and nonprofits and all these kind of stuff. And so if you want to do this, if you want to work full time to help, create resources to help the Christians around the world understand what Bitcoin is and the value proposition that it goes beyond just the speculative asset, we're willing to fund it. And so they gave us some money to start, to allow me to go full time to basically do this. So that's kind of how that happened.
Oh, neat.
Yep.
So tell me, what accomplishments have you had this past year?
Yeah. So man, Lord's been super kind. We've gotten to do a number of really interesting things. This past November, we went to Bitcoin Beach. I went to El Salvador for the first time. We're helping to launch I'm going to be on the board of like a Bitcoin missions nonprofit that basically works to help missions organizations understand Bitcoin, and basically look at the different ways that they can leverage Bitcoin, the tool that is Bitcoin, for to help people all over the world. Additionally, to help them maintain their funding as well. This is something that a lot of people don't think about, but with some of the first people to suffer, the people who are most affected by currency collapses, are nonprofit organizations, because whereas a for-profit organization, you can raise your prices for a number of years or whatever, you can survive by adjusting that way. If you're a nonprofit organization, you have to either have to ask your existing donor base for more money, or you have to go find new donors, which requires more energy, more effort, generally speaking. And so it becomes this again, hamster wheel that is very difficult for a lot of organizations to adapt to. And so over time, you see more and more of them closing. So we're going to be working to try to help churches, think through both the, like logistically, the ways in which Bitcoin can make things like moving money around the world much more efficient. But then also in terms of, just forming a base for their, just a base for their treasuries as well, like Bitcoin as an asset in that context. So we got to go. That trip to El Salvador was kind of like the basis, or like the initial putting the feelers out there for people who are interested in helping us get that off the ground. And then earlier, I'm trying to think. Also, we had the conference last year that went well. There's a number of different things, but then earlier this year as well, we got to go to. I got to go to a university. It's called African Christian University in Zambia, in Africa. Got invited to go there and present and like do basically a 3-day seminar on the ethics of money production in Bitcoin. And so that was fantastic. Vodi Bakum. So Vodi's he was a pastor here in the United States. Was really well known. He had this quote that kind of went viral. It was basically like, we need to stop. He was talking to Christians, and he basically said, we need to stop being surprised when we send our kids off to Caesar and they come home Romans. And so he's basically just talking about the basically political education, or public education, and some of the downsides of it. So he ended up taking his family and moving them to Zambia to teach at this university, to teach theology at this university. And so got invited to go over there and teach, and had a great time with them. Saw the Lord do some really cool things. And then on the heels of that, we did another trip for the nonprofit, the mission side of things. Went to Kenya with Eric Hersman and the Gridless team, and then brought in missionaries or cross-cultural workers from the Middle East, cross-cultural workers from within Africa, and just basically did like a 4 or 5 day Bitcoin education tour, just kind of helping them think through the different issues involved. So yeah, been really neat just to see the Lord open doors. Again, my full-time job is basically having conversations with Christian leaders about Bitcoin. That's what we do a lot of. So
What do you find is the biggest obstacle Christian leaders have to uh, encouraging their followers to engage with Bitcoin?
yeah, I think, I mean, probably the biggest thing would just be the framework through which they're viewing Bitcoin. Again, it makes sense. Most people, the way that they're hearing Bitcoin is a combination of either on like CNBC or cable news. It's all about the price. It's all about the rapid movements of the price, or it's through people that they know. This was at least the case a few years ago, 2020, 2021, was you had people on Facebook just reaching out to you and asking you about Bitcoin and talking about Bitcoin. And so for a lot of people, they don't want to hear about some thing that feels like a mid-level marketing scam. They don't want to hear about that. They don't want to lose money. Many people have lost money and stuff like that. And so that I think that's part of it. Another part of it is, again, just there's so many, like Bitcoin is, there's just so much philosophy, history. I mean, there's so many different. It's like this diamond where you can look at it from a bunch of different directions, and so it's really kind of tough to get your arms around it. And so I think that's another part of it, is just like people. There's so many things that Bitcoin is prefaced upon, that if you see one of those things wrong, you can just have the temptation to dismiss Bitcoin very easily. And so I think all of those things, again, some of the dynamics of inflation and currency collapse we talked about make it more difficult as well, because all of these organizations or most of them are struggling more than they were a few years ago, at least. And so they have there's like more of a time crunch, there's more of a money crunch. And so the prospect of spending time thinking about, and that isn't even an approach, investing in this very new asset, this very volatile asset, just is for some of them, initially at the very least, it just seems such a departure from what would make sense for them to do. It doesn't seem rational. And so I think those are some of the things. There's also, again, stuff in the news, FTX scandals, all those kind of things. That certainly doesn't help. So
Well, I think, as I look at the history of money, it's all gold and silver pretty
yep,
much for centuries and centuries.
yep,
But nobody could really, I mean, there's always continual gold and silver being found, but at a
yep,
somewhat of a steady pace. But
correct,
nobody was actually able to value it. The governments at the time, historically, they could not control the valuation of that gold and silver. That was more decided by the people, I guess,
yep,
what ounce of gold would buy, or whatever their
yep,
standard of measure. But then as we start to get into debt financed economies in the 1700s, 1600s, then we get into the debasement, the substitute for paper money, the debasement of the currency.
yep,
And that affects the church, because the church needs money as a nonprofit to continue to sustain, and it distracts everybody. And the whole deflation, or the inflationary aspects, demand more time from the individual to
correct.
expend on work than in prior centuries. So then now we're at a point now where the debasement is just so rampant across all countries that I think what we see in is it what we see in Bitcoin is that it takes us back before we had debt financed economies to a time where something was stable. I mean, how do you kind of see the history of money and how it affects the church?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the subtitle of our book, Thank God for Bitcoin, is the creation, corruption, and redemption of money. So like I think of like Bitcoin is like it's like this back to the future thing, where it basically it's this scarce money, like in the same way that gold and silver was scarce, and that comes with a number of healthy, correctives. Basically, scarce money is like it's like a diet plan for a severely, morbidly obese person. Like that. That's what it is. It's literally it just provides structure to an existence that otherwise doesn't have any structure or doesn't have any guardrails. You have just these huge debt. We have so much debt in the United States. We have so much debt in all these countries around the world. Everybody's running deficits. Everybody's doing deficit spending, and so like to have something scarce that governments can't themselves change is this again this is the function that something like truth ought to have, right? Like the truth is this thing where it makes you adapt to it. It's something that you can't change. And so basically Bitcoin is this immovable object that that basically forces you to adapt to it. And so the fact that there's only 21 million of them, they can't be created by government is something that again we're not used to seeing. We've been kind of gaslit and Stockholm syndromed into just the idea that governments can do whatever they want to with little consequence, and we're just so used to just getting beat down that we're we're tempted to believe the Kool-Aid that they're trying to force us to drink. And so I think that something like Bitcoin is this you know it's this breath of fresh air, that there is reality. Like there's basic energy reality, in terms of that things have production costs. I have scarce time, I have scarce resources, I have scarce all these different things. Scarcity is this thing that God has built into the world, that he's designed in order for us to basically in order to force us to choose, in order to force us to choose what we're going to spend our time doing, what we're not going to spend our time in our energy doing and not doing. Fiat currency is an attempt by governments to get around those limits, to get around those restraints, to basically functionally enable governments and central banks to operate as gods. And so Bitcoin basically, rains on that parade by basically shining a light on the fact that that isn't true. There's consequences to endless money creation, and basically Bitcoin incentivizes people to adopt it because it will, in a very real sense, take care of them. Like it basically will reward those who basically invest in it. It'll reward them and treat them the same way that it treats the central banker on Wall Street. There's no favoritism showed. Bitcoin's rules of operation don't prioritize the rich over the poor or the poor against the rich. There's one set of one standard of justice, one standard of rules for everybody. And so all those things, I could go on a whole bunch more, but like all of those things are healthy correctives that have been historically have been things that societies and countries and people valued and understood why they were important. And I think Bitcoin is helping. At least I know in my experience, Bitcoin is it's basically bringing those questions and bringing that conversation back to center stage in a way that it hasn't in decades, at least in the United States.
I think that's very interesting. One of the things that, as you said, I've been thinking along those lines a bit. That with what we're seeing with all the currencies, the major currencies devaluing themselves or debasing themselves so rapidly, and some of
Yep.
the other nonsense. I'm reminded of the story of the Tower of Babel, where the
Yep.
people got together and they had a plan and they acted on it, and God basically said, "No, no, no, you're
Yep.
not gods." And
Yep.
he basically, well, he destroyed their language so that nobody
Yep.
could understand each other, or only groups of people could. And maybe this is a financial Tower of Babel, that what we're going to have left after all the currencies have crumbled is Bitcoin.
Yep.
And because Bitcoin was not dependent on any government for its existence or thriving. So
Yep.
that I can see how that then becomes a basis for restarting society on a more uh, sensible platform that's not dependent upon human wisdom.
Yep. Yeah, I think this is a big thing, and there's people like Robert Breedlove and some other people who've talked about this, but just the fact that money is a communication medium. It's a way to communicate value. And so, in the same way that, in the Tower of Babel, they had one language and then God divides it so there's multiple languages. Like you have these, currencies where you do have multiple currencies, but functionally they operate the same way. Like the governments are basically able to create more of them to benefit themselves. And so I think that something like Bitcoin again is far more analogous to something like gold, where it's basically one thing that makes everybody adapt to it. You can't really change gold. You can add baser metals to it, but there's ways to test. There's checks and balances. With fiat currency. There's no checks and balances. Like Wells Fargo, the Federal Reserve isn't going to open up their books and basically show me what's going on. There's just a ton of trust required for the system to work. One of the you mentioned the Tower of Babel. One of the other things that I always bring up, one of the passages that I always bring up is Psalms 2. Psalm 2 basically makes me think of just this situation, kind of the moment that we're in a lot. It's Psalm 2:2. It says, or Psalm 1, so yeah, Psalm 2, 1-3. It says, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." And so what's going on in that passage, you have the rulers of the earth are basically trying to say, how can we get rid of these constraints that God has put on us? And because we want to be our own gods. We want to operate, with autonomously in the world. And so I see that like fiat currency is one of the primary instruments that governments today use to throw off these restraints of scarcity that God has designed to be, part and parcel of the world we live in. Like he's designed the rule of like sowing and exponential reaping to be this thing that governs so much of our relationships, so much of our labor. God wants there to be recompense. Like when you work, God wants there to be when you do good things, God says there's consequences that accompany that, and likewise with when we choose to do bad things, there's consequences that come with that. So this sowing and reaping is designed to be part of our existence. And today we have governments saying that, oh well, debt is just money we owe ourselves. This trivialization of debt, this trivialization of of just dismissing scarcity, and giving governments the ability to just devalue the currency and the money and the time of their citizens at the drop of a hat whenever they want to. And so I think that this is a big issue. And again, these are the conversations that I have with Christians to try to again frame them in biblical parlance to help see that we're not, if you're Christians who are in this Bitcoin world, we're not trying to baptize Bitcoin. Like we're not out here trying to take this thing that's really not good, and just in order to get rich. That's the reason why we're sitting here talking about it. That's got nothing to do with it. Like we really we want, basically we see the ways that if you look through history, currency devaluation, it affects the spread of the gospel. It affects the ability of ministers of the gospel to do their work. It affects the amount of time that they're able to devote to it. And then just again, normal people. It affects all of us. I'm not trying to say that it affects Christians or ministry workers more. It doesn't, but it affects to very real degrees in ways that everyone should care about, including Christians. And so yeah, I think that there's lots of issues here that people, they're feeling the pain of it. They just don't know where the pain is coming from to be able to kind of do something about it. I feel like that's kind of the moment that we're in.
Well, I think that's very powerful stuff, and I like what you're doing because it helps people start to look at Bitcoin and their investing activities from a spiritual perspective.
Correct.
When we look at why are people investing in Bitcoin, there's a lot of different motives. Very few of
Yep.
them are religious,
Yep.
and they're attracted to the anti-government aspects, the privacy aspects, the survivalist aspects. There's a whole slew of motivations, but
Yep.
but people aren't bringing that into the religious obligations in back to their faith. I mean, they realize that they need a financial salvation for where the world's headed. They realize that,
Yep.
but they think they can do it by their own means. And so I think that's where we start to bring Christ back into the picture,
Yep.
because from my vantage point from tax, we're seeing that about 75% of all crypto investors aren't even reporting it to the government.
Yep.
So they're all, this is not differentiated by Christians or not. I think the percentages are the same.
Yeah.
So when I look at that, it's a big problem we have to solve, but it reflects, once again, people are in conflict with their view of money or their own wealth and the
Yeah.
government,
Yeah.
and that's kind of why they got into Bitcoin. They are trying to create their own wealth, but they're
Yeah.
doing it. Their origins and their motivations are not uh, God centered, and
Yeah.
so eventually they're going to run up into a position where they're going up against the God of this world, which would be governments,
Yeah.
the local expression of it. And
Hmm.
we're seeing, we see this in what's happening in the US with all the anti-crypto regulations or
Hmm. Yeah.
hostility. We have
Yeah.
increased taxation regimes. But when we look at it at the same time to see explosive growth,
Yeah.
that's the type of growth we'd see in, God doing in many other ways,
Yep.
in other people's lives historically. So
Yep.
I think it does create that opportunity for people to start to align their actions with their investing more along biblical views. So I think your conversation is important to people to see their lives in underneath in God's world.
Yeah. I think one of the things that further complicates this, right, is because like I've said this numerous times. We live in a point of like definitional crisis. Of like we're at this point where the question, what is this, is increasingly it's always been political, but like this war over the dictionary is just it's at this forefront. So again, just questions that are coming to the forefront on questions that 10 years ago, 15 years ago would have been unthinkably, not controversial at all. And yet every day we're faced with, these questions that are more and more controversial. Just people genuinely who are genuinely confused about, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What is money? This is, for a lot of us in the Bitcoin world, this is one of the questions that has been, fostered a lot of you know just work and study, and is just trying to understand, well, what is money, and how do I know? And I think one of these questions that people are trying to answer right now is what is government? What is government, and how do we know? Because again, at this point, when I see some of the like the anti-government sentiment, that, and I see that in Bitcoiners, I do, but I'm much more sympathetic to a lot of it, because it's not just anti-government in a vacuum. It's anti what government has become. And so when I look at what governments are doing things today that were unthinkable even 30 years ago, 20 years ago. They've involved themselves, the creeping, you have government creep going on. They're moving their hands into more and more things. And so it's this idea of, when I think about, especially the United States government, I think of it like it's this morbidly obese person who they're consuming everything in sight, instead of the things that they're designed to consume that will allow them to more effectively and efficiently do the job that they're put there to do. And so I think that basically anarchists, some of that stuff it's a symptom of people who are recognizing governments are moving into places that they frequently we've only seen in authoritarian countries. They're moving into increasing roles in our lives that are dominating and taking over some of the responsibility that God has designed to be held by individuals, families, local communities. You have these federal governments, these national governments that are coming over and taking on more of this responsibility in ways that are both unbiblical and in not healthy. Just if you just even just are observing, what does this do? You could look at a lot of things. You could look at like the healthcare system. You can look at just the system of we have friends who have adopted children, and like they just talk about that system and how there's so much messed up incentives and things that are going on there because the government has just kind of stepped in and made these top down rules. And so I just think you see that a lot. And I think we've put off, in the name of financial progress, or in the name of all these different things, we've kind of put off these harder, more foundational questions for way too long. And we're starting to get to the point where we can't put them off any longer because the consequences are very dire, and very, you get to the point where we're just accepting increasingly insane things. And so I think, again, I look at Bitcoin as this tool that opens up conversations about other things as well. It kind of shines light into areas that maybe there hasn't been, the light of the gospel and the light of other things shined in them for a long time. There's things that have been taken for granted that are crumbling right now. And Bitcoin is one of the things that has enabled me to have some of these conversations with people that I never would have thought I would have had them with.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, that's really encouraging. I could talk forever about this.
I know.
Tell
Yeah.
us about, you have a conference coming up, right at the
Yep.
Bitcoin conference.
Yep.
Why don't you tell us the date and
Yeah.
some of the speakers that'll be there?
It's going to be July 24th and 25th in Nashville. It's going to be a two-day event. Day one is basically like a Christian economics conference. It's like an intro to, because again, Lord willing, we're going to have people who aren't Bitcoiners. Like the goal is not just for this to be an event where the faithful Christian Bitcoiners come and we just all hang out together. The goal is really to basically kind of, hey, let's have these conversations. That people are feeling the weight of inflation. People are feeling the weight of out of control home prices that are just pricing them out. All of these issues. So let's kind of get in and do some of this definitional work. Let's define like what is money. Let's define what is government. Let's define some of these things and with Bible in hand. Let's talk about some of these issues and then look at on day two. Like let's look at what does Bitcoin have to do with those things. I gave a presentation out at a Bitcoin conference in Portland. We got asked to come and do this presentation, and I named the presentation "What hath God to do?" What hath Bitcoin to do with Jerusalem? Which is basically there's a church father who basically had this quote. There were people in the church who were trying to bring together Greek philosophy with scriptural teaching, and he was suspicious of this. I think it was Athanasius. He was suspicious of this desire to do this, and so he asked this question: what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? And so basically we want to have this conversation of like, hey, here's things that the scriptures like talk about, and like these are scriptural priorities. These are this is what this look like, and then here's what Bitcoin has to do with it. It's not Bitcoin is a tool. It's a means to other ends. And so our goal is not to glory in Bitcoin. It's to help people see Bitcoin as a tool through which to be used for the glory of God and the good of people everywhere. I'll just give a couple of plugs. So we have a number of pastors who are speaking at the conference. We have probably the biggest name from the economic world is Jörg Guido Holzmann, who's a Austrian economist and Mises fellow who wrote a book called The Ethics of Money Production. So he's going to be coming, and John Moody, bunch of other stuff. You can find out all the speakers at our website, and we're going to be naming more speakers by the time the conference actually rolls around. So we're going to be doing that. It's going to be at a venue called Rocket Town. It's like a perfect venue for what we're doing. And you can find out more information at tgfb.com/conference.
All right. So they can find out more about your shows and other podcasts at tgfb.com then, all right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. We have the Thank God for Bitcoin podcast, and then the Thank God for Nostr podcast. If you thought the Thank God for Bitcoin podcast was niche, you haven't seen anything yet, because Nostr is this decentralized internet protocol that is primarily used for social media stuff right now, but it's fascinating, and so I host another podcast over there, and we talk about a bunch of stuff.
Thank you very much. Jordan, for being on the show, and this is very encouraging stuff. I'm really excited for you and for the conference, and I hope to have you on again.
Yep. Appreciate you, Clinton. Thank you for what you do.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to today's show, and I hope you enjoy it. Please give us comments. We would love to respond to any questions you give us. You have tax questions that we can apply to. We will try to address it in future shows. Please hit like, subscribe, follow. Thank you. Have a great day.
The Clinton Donnelly Show, where we explore how taxation and regulations of cryptocurrencies affect your daily life as an investor. Clinton is one of the top experts in crypto taxation in the US. Clinton has a law degree in international financial regulation. He is an enrolled agent and certified as a cryptocurrency anti-financial crime specialist. This show is sponsored by CryptoTaxAudit.com, the income tax experts for US crypto investors. Go to CryptoTaxAudit.com to learn more and schedule a private tax consultation now. The opinions expressed in this show are not legal advice. Tax and regulations are complicated. Your situation is unique, so you should always consult a tax professional.